Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
We are nearing the end of November, and snow has officially graced the beautiful state of Minnesota. And my son is thrilled. This week, we are pleased to welcome Preya Samsundar back to The Breakdown. Preya is our resident Republican messaging pro who has worked for the MNGOP, the RNC, and various campaigns of all levels. With Preya, we're going to start by breaking down her recent op-ed in the Star Tribune titled, "It's Time for Minnesota Republicans to Learn from Their Mistakes." We will get into some additional updates to Trump's cabinet appointments and some additional insights from the November 5th election. And we will continue our discussion on great op-eds by ending with a piece Michael wrote for the Star Tribune this week called "No Regrets from This Republican About Endorsing Harris." Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. So Preya, we have not chatted with you since the election, so I'm really excited to get into all things Trump win, Republican trifecta in Washington, D.C., which you were just out visiting. But I want to start here in Minnesota and let you, I have some of my favorite parts of your op-ed, but you wrote an op-ed about Minnesota Republicans learning from their mistakes, focused on the abysmal choice of Royce White for our U.S. Senate candidate. And this is something we've talked with you about, but Michael and I have chatted about time after time on this campaign or on this podcast, and how just disappointing and frustrating that pick was. And while Klobuchar is a master at her craft and going to be tough to take down whenever, if that ever happens, it certainly won't happen with candidates like Royce White. So talk to us a little bit about your piece, why you felt this was important to write, and how you got it out there.
Yeah, so this was actually like the first op-ed that I've written that was actually something that I crafted and put my name on myself. Becky is from being a comms person over the years. We write a lot of op-eds and LTEs and all sorts of things, but it's never in our voice. It's never for us, really, but for the folks that we work with. And so that was a unique step that this would be the first piece that I would actually put my name to. And obviously, I worked for Joe Frazier's campaign, worked really hard to try to get him across the finish line, both with the endorsement process, the primary, obviously failed to do both. And I know that there are Royce White supporters who seem to think that we're just picking on him. I think that this is a larger conversation about the things that we are doing wrong, but I used Royce White as the most recent example because I do feel like this is our rock bottom moment as a party. The candidates that we've chosen in the past were wonderful people, very nice guys, maybe not the fighters that folks would have wanted that could go toe to toe with some of these guys. And I understand why folks gravitated towards Royce White, because he had that fighter mentality that maybe a Jeff Johnson or a Jim Newberger didn't have. Right? I can understand that. But I think when you look at the baggage, you look at the rhetoric, it doesn't really embrace the GOP politics that we have come to know and love. It really doesn't even embrace the Trump politics that folks have gravitated towards over the last 8 years. And so I think choosing him probably was a move out of desperation by a lot of Republicans who were just like, we've tried the nice guys of the world. Let's try something very different. What a way to swing that pendulum from nice guys to Royce White. But I feel like everything that I had warned folks about, that you and Michael have warned folks about, would happen with with Royce White at the top of the ticket would happen. It did happen. We didn't lose control. We didn't lose control of the House or anything like that. We were very fortunate to have a tie, but sometimes I wonder if we had a candidate that had the ability to put more resources in, was actually cared about being a candidate and not just promoting themselves, would there be a difference maker somewhere? And so I wanted to look at this not from I'm angry and I'm going to tell you that this guy is wrong for all the wrong reasons, but I actually want to look at the data. I want to look at the numbers and show you that it wasn't me pointing a finger or Becky or Michael or Pat Garofalo or somebody else pointing the finger. But this was a mandate from Minnesotans who looked at Royce White as a candidate and said, you are far from lacking.
And I do want to get into those, excuse me, those numbers because I think it's really compelling of looking at this situation. But I do want to touch on two different things real quick. One, like you mentioned, it is hard to put yourself out there as a communications professional who has spent the last decade plus writing for other people, doing that in your own voice. I know this is something that I struggled with starting this podcast. Was I've spent so much time behind the scenes. So I do really applaud you because that is really tough. You say in your op-ed that from a Minnesota Republican who desperately loves Minnesota and wants to see Republicans be competitive and successful in a state that so desperately needs our voice and leadership, here's the cycle's hard truth. In order to win a statewide race for the first time since 2006, we must do a better job at candidate selection. And I think it's really a good reminder to folks that you are a Republican. You want Republicans to be successful. This is not just a bashing of a party or principles or policies or anything of that standard. It's a desire from somebody who's been actively involved. Michael and I have been on the periphery a little bit more when it comes to Republican politics here in the state. And so from you, somebody who's been on the ground, been in the fight, I really applaud you for taking that step because it's really hard. And this kind of goes to also what we've chatted a lot about is the broken endorsement battle, because I've been in those rooms and when you sit there with the 2,000 delegates and you get a fiery speech, and I have heard, I haven't watched it, I was not there in the room, but I heard that Royce White's speech was a great fire. Feel it, all those good, warm, fuzzy feelings deep in your soul from a candidate who's going to go out and fight the good fight for you. I get that draw and that allure from some of these candidates and why we get to this place. But I think it also compounds the endorsement process, which is a conversation for another day. But yeah, wow. So thank you for writing this.
Thank you.
First of all, let me also echo that. One of the things that I will compliment you both on is your outspokenness, which I think is desperately needed. Your introspection. Becky, you and I have sparred before publicly, and Preya you and I have sparred before publicly on some things. We have all not agreed with each other at various times. But one thing I do want to compliment you both on is you have consistently, I think, been Republicans who have been willing to be introspective, particularly after elections. Republicans like to portray themselves as the party of accountability. The least responsible party officials are the ones after they lose an election, and they're the worst ones. And so this was foreseen. This has been a consistent problem with the party, and I applaud Preya for speaking. It's not easy. It wasn't easy when I did it, Becky. It certainly wasn't easy when you did it. And I will say, out of all three of us, the one that I think has endured the most public scorn has been Preya by an absolute online troll bully. Royce White is an asshole, a major league asshole, and he showed that throughout the election. And I'm going to say a few things here. We like to talk about authenticness. When I was a party officer at various times, people used to say all the time, this candidate's authentic, this candidate's authentic. Let me tell you something. My answer on authenticity has always remained the same. I went to high school with people who are authentically assholes. And so you can be an authentic asshole. There's a difference between being authentic and being nice. You can be principled and be nice. You can be controversial and be engaging and polite. Royce White is a rude asshole. And that's unfortunately what happened here. And the party has chosen to embrace that. And they endorsed it, and it was a mess. And I thought the party's endorsement process hit rock bottom in 2022. It hit rock bottom in 2024. And I don't think the party has learned any lessons, because as of today, we have a number of candidates who are at the same tier level. In fact, one in which includes Royce White, who's announced he's running for the United States Senate or governor again. I believe if the endorsement were held today, there would be no top tier candidate that would file, and one of the three rumored candidates would likely get there. And so I want to just have a lot more to say on this topic, and I don't want to filibuster, but I wanted to say a few points. Proud of Preya for speaking up. Proud of Becky when you've done it in the past. And let's kick this off because I got to have a lot more to say.
All right, Preya, I want to get into some of like you said, the proof is in the election results and the numbers speak for themselves. This is not us just sitting here saying, we don't like this guy, you should listen to us. The proof is there. So why don't you get into a little bit of those numbers, those election results? I've got a couple of them in front of me and they are very compelling.
Yeah, they are. I think the three numbers that really stood out to me, I highlighted them in the piece, were if you looked at the Trump-Royce number, Royce underperformed Donald Trump by 8.7%. which is
Ouch.
huge. That's nearly double-digit numbers. Donald Trump lost 2020 by 7 points, and Royce White underperformed even that. When you look at the congressional numbers, Michael, you pointed this out in your op-ed that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Donald Trump underperformed every single congressional district except the 2nd congressional district. Royce White underperformed every congressional district. I think it was 4 counties entirely that Royce White did not underperform. And he underperformed by 11.5%. And the thing is, we saw this argument online after I posted the article about it's Minneapolis, it's St. Paul, it's Hennepin and Ramsey County. And it was like, no, that's not it. When you look at it county by county, the reality is that, and this kind of shocked me too, as I literally went through and looked at every single county. It was Houston County where Royce had like the biggest margins of underperformance. He underperformed Brad Finstad by 20 points and underperformed Trump by 16 points.
In Houston County.
Houston County.
Now,
which is in the first.
Yeah, to tell people on this, if you're looking at the map, which corner of the state Houston County is it? It's way over to the right. It's the corner that borders on Wisconsin and I think is it Iowa? Yeah, it would border on Wisconsin actually. Yeah. So it's it's the farthest county to the southeast to the southeast in Minnesota, correct?
I believe so, yeah. It's a very tried and true, very hardcore conservative county. And the reality is you can pick apart different numbers. There were a number of instances where both Donald Trump and Congressman Michelle Fischbach did it in a number of counties. I think Finstad did in a couple of counties as well, where they got over 70% of the vote. Royce White didn't crack more than like 63% in a given conservative county. He was still underperforming even then. And the reality is he and his followers will say that his argument is that the reason he underperformed is because there's no voter ID. That's just ridiculous. And Michael's face says it all, because the reality is at the end of the day is that if Royce White is the only one to underperform, that means voter ID didn't impact Donald Trump, didn't impact Stauber, Fischbach, Emmer, Finstad. It didn't impact Tad Jude, Dahlia, May. It didn't impact any of those guys. And it definitely didn't impact the even further down ballot races, like the state house races, where I think it's Elliot Engels. That was a Kamala Harris district. He managed to win re-election in the suburbs. And the reality is, Royce White didn't win it. Donald Trump didn't win it. There are Republicans who sat on the sidelines. They voted Republican down ballot, and they did not vote Republican up ticket.
I think it's just wild. When you said it by 11 points, I just want to reiterate, President Donald Trump lost Minnesota by 4.2 percentage points. Royce White lost Minnesota by just under 16 percentage points. That means that almost 12% of these voters went and voted for President Donald Trump and either voted for Amy Klobuchar, voted third party, or didn't vote in the U.S. Senate race. That's wild.
Correct. And I want to point out something is that, and I want to ask you this question open-ended, but I'd like to know, I hope your answer is mine, but I'm going to throw it out there and see how it plays. There were people after Royce White got endorsed who tried to make the case that there's no such thing as a coattail effect, that Royce White being on the top of the ticket would have no impact on the down ballot races. My argument was, and it's been a consistent argument, was for Republicans to win in this state, there's a smaller balance beam, a smaller landing strip. Republicans have to work in concert, in synergy. There has to be some teamwork. And so in order to maximize the Republican vote, you need to have a unified team. And having a goofball gadfly candidate like that will impact the cohesion of the race, aside from the accepted political norm of there being a coattail effect. My question to both of you is, did Royce White, from the data, is it your opinion that Royce White being nominated and being the candidate for the United States Senate hurt the overall Republican ticket?
I would argue likely yes. I don't have anything I can truly point to right here, But historically, people tend to fall off the further down the ballot they get. So if you're already falling off at U.S. Senate, what is your driver to continue down?
Yep.
So historical data would show it certainly did. Even if it's 1, 2, 5 votes in some of these races, that is the difference maker in the House of who won or lost a race. So I have to think that, yes, it would have.
Preya?
I think to your point, Michael, to argue that Royce White didn't have a coattail effect, you would have to argue the same thing for Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't have a coattail effect. The reality is that when you were higher up on the ticket, you were going to have more resources. You were going to have more dollars. You're going to have more focus on that race that is going to help bring some of those folks down ballot with you. And we saw it with Donald Trump in Michigan. We saw it in Wisconsin. We saw it in Nevada. We saw it in Virginia. We saw it all across the country. I think with Royce White, the argument that we always made from like the Fraser campaign standpoint is that, look, we know that beating Amy Klobuchar is a very tough battle. But we also knew that Donald Trump was not going to spend an unlimited amount of resources in this state. So you needed a strong top of the ticket to be that placeholder where Donald Trump was not going to be front and center, or JD Vance was not going to be front and center every single time, to help remind folks that there's an election happening and that Republicans are running, and that their message, which should be a cohesive down ballot message, would spread throughout and would energize people. So you needed somebody strong at the top of the ticket. The reality is this was the cheapest race that Amy Klobuchar has ever run. I was talking with a reporter here in state maybe a couple of weeks before Election Day. And I think at that point, Amy Klobuchar had only spent $500,000 on TV. I don't think she spent much more than that. I don't think she spent $1 million actually running a race here. She probably used her war chest to go help other candidates elsewhere, which also impacted those races, because where Amy was a couple of weeks before Election Day, she wasn't here battling it out with Royce White. She was out campaigning with Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin. Does Eric Hovde owe Royce White a call to thank him for losing his race by what, 17, 20,000 votes? Because that could have been a difference maker, because Amy was using her resources to help prop up Tammy Baldwin in her tight race in Wisconsin. It's not just a down ballot effect here, but it's also because you allowed Amy to play and not compete here in state. She was able to help her down ballot candidates and elevate them, and then elevate other candidates who were in very tight races that could have helped us expand our majorities in Washington.
So both of you think that it had an effect?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to use that as a talking point from now on. Because I'm telling you, I've had smart people, or people who I think are smart, go out there and try to make the case that, you can just endorse Royce White and we'll have no impact on stuff. Having worked on legislative races, Preya just brought up a fantastic point, and it's a fantastic point that should be noted. And Becky, you may note this, when planning out legislative races, it's important from a strategic standpoint that maybe you ensure that the caucus leader on either side has a competitive race. So they have to remain local and they have to do things. I think one of the most important, and so by Royce White being the candidate, Klobuchar was not required to focus on the race because he wasn't credible and he wasn't worthy of there being an endorsement, which afforded her opportunities to spend her time and resources in other place. The other thing that I would say is Klobuchar has a rich history of doing that. When she first went in the lead up to running for the United States Senate in 2006, as the then Hennepin County attorney, she had a political committee that donated a vast amount of resources to local party units all across the state. Amy Klobuchar has always been value added to the DFL ticket. As much as Republicans are frustrated with Keith Ellison has always been value added to the overall DFL ticket. It should not surprise anyone that Republicans have not won statewide since Keith Ellison was elected to Congress in 2006. Keith Ellison has always been value added to the DFL operation and machine. And when Republicans are endorsing goofballs like Royce White for the United States Senate, who then on top of it run such campaigns that not only are they a personal drain and a liability to the Republican Party, they free up the resources and time of the DFL challenger that they're running against so they can be more value added to the DFL ticket. It's a double whammy.
Completely agree. I will say that I am, from my experience working with Tom Emmer, that's something him and his office Congressman Tom Emmer pride themselves on doing within the 6th and even in some targeted districts across the state, from funding and donations, but also to getting the Emmer staff goes out and does that. I believe that largely. I'm going to, again, give a shout out and round of applause to David Fitzsimmons, who was the leader back instituting that back in the day, does similar things with Fishbach's office and team and Finstad's campaign team, obviously on the campaign side, not on the official side, making that very clear. But it's something we haven't had statewide. So we can do that on the small scale, but we haven't had those leaders to be able to do that statewide, which brings me to one of our $1 million questions. How do we change it? How do we change this so in 2026 and beyond, we can be successful? Because 2026, our constitutional officers are up on the ballot. We have Tina Smith up on the ballot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tina's up in
Senator Smith, yes.
Senator Smith is up in 2026. How do we do it? The endorsement ballots process isn't going to go away overnight. So how do we get those good, viable candidates, whether it's through the endorsement process or successful through the primary process? How do we find them? How do we get them? How do we win?
I think the first thing is focusing on quality control. The one thing that kind of shocked me throughout this entire process, and it feels weird that I didn't know this despite having worked for the state party and having worked in the state for the last 10 years working to elect Republicans, is that there are actually no rules on what kind of candidate is acceptable to even compete for the endorsement process in this state. It is literally the only rule that they have is that they are constitutionally able to run for the specific office that they want to run for. And it's just mind-boggling because, as we all know, the Constitution is very vague to begin with, but I'm sure that...
Party Constitution, not the United States Constitution. I'm not going to tolerate any bad-mouthing of the United States Constitution on this podcast.
You can imagine that the Founding Fathers never thought when they were sitting down to put the Constitution together that they would have to encounter somebody like Royce White, or that people would actually vote to let him into the ballot, or even Mark Robinson for that matter. And so the fact that there was just this idea that, okay, because they're constitutionally able to be on a ballot, therefore we should move them through the endorsement process.
I see the point you're making.
That's not our role as a party. If we're saying that we have an endorsement process, we should be doing that because we're saying we as a party want to ensure that Republicans in the state of Minnesota have the best opportunity to succeed. Therefore, we are inserting ourselves, unlike other states that just have straight run to primary or endorse in very different fashions because every state party is different across the country. We are going to institute ourselves as quality control. We are going to decide how to weed these people out to make sure cranks and crazies aren't making it through the process. And I think it is incumbent on the party to take those steps to figure out, okay, we cannot just have folks sitting on a committee saying, we don't really know what constitutes a candidate to be able to go through the endorsement process. We're just going to say if they are allowed to do so by the Constitution, then that's fine. Then at that point, don't have an endorsement process. Let people figure it out for themselves, because you know what? They showed in 2024 that they were far more discerning than the folks making the decisions.
I do think I completely agree, because I have sat as AD, I sat through nominations, not as a voting member of the nominations committee, but as a party observer of the nominations committee. And first, I do always want to give a little nod to the grassroots process, which I came up through and do have, has a special place in my heart. But there needs to be more than that, because we have had candidates, and this goes for all the different levels, or party officers, U.S. Senate, Congress, whatever it might be, that have criminal records, people that have had major pasts with financial issues, bankruptcy, tax liens. We've had people who were either inactive or previously were suing the party or party officers. Just these things that are like, once you get on the other side, are going to be in the media, are going to be things that get in front of voters. And so I understand the desire to want to be kind and nice and not out anybody of that. But we need to do that because the other side or the press are going to do that. That's their job. That's their due diligence, is to find those things and let voters know. And so it's always been really frustrating to me that there hasn't been those checks and balances, or even conversations with some seasoned campaign professionals, which I know are dirty words and people, the establishment campaign professionals, but I've had conversations pre-endorsement with candidates back when I was still working and trying to figure out who I'm supporting and if I'm going to jump on a campaign, and had a candidate say, I don't like making phone calls. Well, that's enough for me. You're not going to be a statewide candidate, because if you don't like making 20 to 40 phone calls a day, 20 to ask for money and 20 to ask for support, you are not going to be successful. But those are not questions that get asked. What's your Christmas list look like? Can you raise $50,000 tomorrow just by asking your friends and family? Are you comfortable calling up somebody and saying, hey, can you and your wife max out to me and write me checks for $11,000? If you're not comfortable doing that, there is no room for success. But those aren't questions we're asking. We're asking if you support the party platform and if you're going to support Donald Trump and these nice, squishy, feel-good Republican kind of red meat questions, which have a time and place, but not when we're trying to look about the future viability of these candidates and success of our party. It's so frustrating. Quality control, I agree. It's tough because I don't see that change being made, because the people who have to make that change, aside from party officials, are the one that help with the city chairs nominate people to become on the nominations committee. So apart from some of that and having that as a placeholder to make any true changes to the party constitution or bylaws that would force that to be the case, it comes by the people who are effing up in the first place, the delegates.
And I want to just make a note and a correction on something. When Preya was talking about the Constitution, I thought she was going to be referring to the party Constitution, but she was right. She was referring to the U.S. Constitution because, as then she later explained, and I understood the point she was making, and I apologize for interrupting you. You were speaking that the only standard that exists was what the United States Constitution requirement is. And as Becky knows, and as Preya knows, and as I know, there is a Republican Party of Minnesota Constitution, guidelines and principles that it runs by. There's party bylaws, there are rules for convention that all dictate this stuff. And so the point I would just say is, and to clean up my own interruption there, was Preya was saying that the Republican Party only kind of requirement is that they follow the base constitutional requirement, which is age and residency in this. And that's what they did with Royce White. The problem that we haven't done, and I'm really proud of you again, Preya, for having this, because when I read your op-ed, I was like, yes, this is fantastic. It was great, and it got a lot of reaction. And Becky, this is something that we've talked about for 2 years, is we've tried to carve out a space to be thoughtful and responsible critics. But I have to say to you that this is I think that we are now entered the point of some tough love and just maybe being tough, because Preya's points are incredibly well-founded, and they're based in logic, reason, and common sense. Becky, when you've made the same points, and when I've made the same points there, but Preya is leading that charge right now. And what she needs, I think, is people like us to platform her and to have her on and talk about it. But also, she needs support. She needs people. How this gets changed is more people in this party start listening to Preya and others who have made this point. Because here's the problem that's happening right now, is that every election cycle since 2006, there has been this type of talk. And it really heated up after 2010, and particularly after 2014. And I will say to you, something happened at the 2014 convention that I will put a pin in as a point where things started to go south, which is the arrival of Philip Parrish at that convention, where you had candidates who were prepared and had done the work that I think any rational analyst of politics would say there were multiple candidates at that convention that had done some of that base work that professionals like Becky and Preya would say need to be done. But then a guy walked into the convention and gave some type of sermon and speech and brought the house down. And since that time, what's happened is rather the state convention being a culmination of activities, a culmination of where there's been a competitive race like it was in 12 and 10. Becky, I was the deputy chair in 2010. You were working on Emmer's campaign in 2010. Pray, I don't know if you were born yet, but that was a competitive race between Marty Seifert and Tom Emmer, and it ended at the state convention. But that was a culmination of work where there was a final contest at the state convention. What's happened now is the conventions in some ways have become the kickoff for these gadfly candidates. And so you have people that show up and you have activists in these seats that are thinking they're going to be entertained, and they anoint these candidates with stuff. We have to stop assuming and stop making the assumption that activists and the delegates in the seat are making informed decisions. They're not. They're part of the problem. And I'm someone who was a grassroots officer, and we've all, I think, at various points in our life had been party activists. And I'm not trying to target them, but you are part of the problem. If you sat in the convention the day that Royce White was endorsed, and Royce went up on stage and you said, I think that guy can be a United States Senator, let's endorse him, you are part of the problem. If you voted him, if you placed his name in nomination, and there's people out there after he got endorsed, after he started acting up, that were people that had placed his name in nomination, that were close to his campaign, that were speaking out and didn't want to speak out. They were speaking out privately, but they didn't want to speak out publicly because they didn't want to speak out against the endorsement process. You want to know what's more important in the state? Winning elections rather than an endorsement process. The Democrats have learned to figure this out. And I just want to, again, applaud Preya for just taking a very strong leadership point, and particularly right now, as there are candidates running for party chair and the partyship leadership elections are coming up in mid-December, Preya's op-ed and her voice should be elevated everywhere that it can be. I'm disappointed with Preya a bit that she decided to go on AM 1280 The Patriot first rather than giving us the exclusive, but we're certainly appreciative of her coming on today.
Just one last thing I will say on this, as I know I want to get to
We're not
the rest
done,
of the
but you can be, yeah, I am.
The joy of this is we have approximately another 7 months before the GOP endorsing convention to continue these conversations. So get excited. But the last thing I will just say is I am all about working for and supporting and loving a great, passionate, fire-throwing speaker. I had the pleasure of working for Congressman Emmer for some 5+ years. I managed Jason Lewis's campaign. I get it. Congressman Jason Lewis, correct. Wow, you're just on it today.
I want to give him...
Hey, I love titles. I am all about it. I got to pick up my slack here. But what I will say is when we look at some of the most successful leaders on both sides of the aisle, but in particular, some of the leaders here in the state, I don't necessarily think we can look at Senator Smith and Senator Klobuchar and think, man, that's one fired up speaker. Or Betty McCollum. Like, these are great. They're doing great things for their party and for the state and what they stand for. But they are not successful just because they're a great fire-throwing, mudslinging speaker. They are successful because they are principled and they know how to get the job done, and they're willing to talk to people and make the phone calls and do the work. And that's what we need to look for. So I understand, especially in this Trump era, how easy it is to want that and desire that and be drawn to that. But we got to start expecting more. It's not enough. It hasn't been enough for a while. And we got to look beyond and find other qualifications when picking this. Preya, I want you to Michael, go ahead.
I have a quick question for Preya. What has been, I want to enthusiastically, much more than I have, applaud you for you speaking up. I'm curious, what's the reaction that's come? And do you think there's momentum? And if there isn't momentum, what more could be done for people to support, which I think I don't speak for Becky, but to support this and elevate this? Are you getting a good reaction? Do you think there's going to be changes? And if not, what are the steps you think need to be done?
I will say that I was actually very surprised at how positive the response had been. I had gotten a lot of really good feedback, folks that were very appreciative of having someone speak out about it, both here in Minnesota and places around the country. And I've had a couple of folks reach out just asking if I would be willing to meet just to talk about what changes and ideas that I have that could be helpful going forward. So I really appreciate that, and definitely going to take folks up on that. But I just the thing that I really struggled with this race, particularly this year, and I want folks to think about as we go ahead, is that I was raised as somebody, as a person, to have integrity at the end of the day, and to be somebody who calls balls and strikes. And I enjoy a good fight more than anyone. I think, Michael, you'd probably agree with that some days when I go back at you. So I love doing what I do and helping Republican candidates succeed. And I love pointing out all the things that I can about Democrats when they aren't meeting the standards that I think that they should for representing folks. I did it with Amy Klobuchar in 20 when she ran for president. I've done it when she was run for Senate. I did the same thing with Tina Smith. But I think we find ourselves backed into a corner and being like perpetually crushed by this wall that's coming at us when we elect folks like Royce White who have the baggage that they do, because we can no longer point out those exact same flaws in the Democrats. Because if you were to take Royce White and make him a Democrat, what would the activist response be? What would Becky and I's response be if we're on a campaign and we see somebody like Royce White coming in from the Democrats? We'd have a field day.
Correct.
What was her name? Senator Mitchell, right?
Mhm.
Just imagine, we all saw the Republican response right off the bat. But the reality is that all of that kind of stopped when you pointed out Royce White did the same thing too. Our leverage to actually be the moral authority, which we have done successfully for years and decades past, we no longer have that authority when we make Royce White and candidates like him our new standard bearer. And we put him on the pedestal and saying, this is the ideal candidate for office. And so I think we also need to review it in that perspective as well. And I would challenge folks to look at it from that perspective. The reality is, if you wouldn't look at a Democrat with the same exact background and be like they're fine and fit for office, you wouldn't call on them to resign. Lord knows we've called on Ilhan Omar plenty of times to resign for
So is Becky.
her behavior. maybe we need to find our way back to that moral high ground and that moral authority that we once held proudly.
I want to say one thing that's different, then we can move on if Becky wants to, which is this. One thing that is very unique about what's going on, particularly with the dynamic with Preya, is the fact that Royce White and some of his henchmen have targeted Preya directly, targeted her online and gone after her in crude, vicious, and appalling ways. And he's a bully, and he's a straight up bully. And I got to just say, Preya, I'm proud of you for being strong and staying on social media, writing this op-ed. You knew exactly what was going to happen when you wrote that op-ed, that you were going to get trolled, and you did it. And even if in this particular situation, I agree with nearly every word that you wrote, but there are times when you and I have disagreed, and I'll still be an advocate for your voice. And Becky and I have always been advocates for people doing long form stuff, even if we disagree with the issues on some ways, the path to do that. And so I hope that you continue to speak up. We'll be advocates for you, but I want to just note that you spoke up after knowing exactly what was going to happen, which makes the fact that you spoke up and did what you did even more remarkable and worthy of praise. So I want to just applaud you for that.
Thank you.
Absolutely agree. And like I said, we've got many months before the 2025 endorsing convention, or 2026. Oh gosh, I was wrong with my years. Wow, we have a lot of time before we are endorsing the candidate for 2026. So we'll be chatting about this. Excited to see how things flesh out and
I think
how things end up. We've got State Central around the corner.
Yep.
We might, party officers, we have to be reelected or new ones be elected. Things could change. We'll continue to have these conversations and hope that they do. But I do want to move on for the sake of our conversation today. We have some new Trump cabinet appointees. Last week, Michael and I went through the first round of appointees. There's some new ones that I want to, some that we can be quick about, some that we can dive into. So let's get to it. Starting with Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum, Governor of North Dakota. This is a pick that I'm a fan of. I think we chatted about Burgum when he was running for president as being one of the adults in the room, having a sane voice, a solid standing, and just reasonable approach to things. He is going to be, we know Trump loves fossil fuels, as do I. Drill, baby, drill. Burgum is the governor of the
That's great.
third largest oil producing state. And so I think it's going to be a good mix. Burgum also supports carbon capture. It's something that I've worked on a little bit with some projects at work. And so he has been a leader in that. They're likely going to pull back some of Biden's wind farm agenda. I like this pick. I think this is a great pick. Any issues, any love, any hate of this?
I think it was a great pick. I mean, there's nothing flatter than North Dakota, so he spent a lot of time managing vast empty lands.
I thought it was a great cabinet pick, as it should be. Boring.
Yes. Let's
In
bring
that
boring
context,
back.
I mean, it just
Make cabinet pits boring again.
Yes.
I do have to give a shout out to Jeff Kolb, who had a great tweet last week when it was North Dakota and South Dakota governors have both been tapped for Trump's administration. Somebody tweeted that it was a great week to be a Dakota governor, and he tweeted that it was a really rough week to be a Minnesota governor. I thought it was a funny little tweet. Sorry, Mike. For commerce, Howard Lutnick, a Wall Street guy, has been in Trump's orbit for quite a while, helping fill some of these positions or figure out who would be best. Big financer of his campaign, bundler. I don't know enough about him personally to love or hate it. It seems like somebody that he can depend on and has been in his orbit and has been working successfully in finance. Sure.
I don't like him because of his commentary that he had with Caitlin Collins. I believe it was him about RFK, which we'll get to soon.
Next up, Health and Human Services, RFK Jr. He ran independent campaign for president. He is very notably anti-vaccine. This one was tough for me.
He's pro-choice?
This one, pro-choice. There you go. So that will be interesting. This one was tough for me. I have a lot of issues with some of the very unfounded, irresponsible things that I think he has discussed that have been proven unfounded and irresponsible and anti-science. And I think it is really problematic with a sect of our country, in particular, a sect of our party, who don't check and look into things and take it at its face. And as a mother of a young child, I can tell you, I'm all about the vaccines, baby. And it really is concerning to know that the future, whether it's the next 4 years or what this means for future of vaccines in this country, but the possible issues it can have to transferable diseases that have been eradicated thanks to vaccines. It's just, I had to take a couple hours after Twitter after this one. I knew it was coming. We joked about it last week, but this one just really irks me.
Preya?
I think it's interesting, to your point, Becky, there are a lot of issues that we're just going to need to parse through in the coming weeks or months just to really understand what is just talk for him versus what is actually going to be like a policy implemented decision. I'm talking with some of my friends in DC. There's a lot of jokes about don't ban our Diet Cokes, saying goodbye to red dye number 40. I do think, as one friend put it, yeah, there are really a lot of really bad things that could come along with this. There are probably also some interesting things that could happen from food quality perspectives, just because I think we all know that food quality here in the United States is not as great as it is in Europe. There's a reason why Americans can eat all the pasta they want, despite having gluten intolerances and not having it here. But whether or not potential benefits like that outweigh everything else that happens, is going to be the thing that we all have to watch out for. I do think it's weird the man who is like against vaccine, this Make America Healthy Again, is chowing down on McDonald's with the Trump team and buying Zins by the packs. Maybe he's not fully bought in the way that he portrays it. So I think this is just one of those things we have to wait and see whether the words match up with the actions.
I just, before we get as an entry point into the RFK discussion, I just want to remind our listeners that I once saw RFK naked in a locker room at Northwest Athletic Club in St. Louis Park, which is a reference point I should just make, which we've discussed on the breakdown before.
And to clarify once again, you were fully clothed at the time.
Yes, I was fully clothed. He was
Not.
just as you think a Kennedy would be, flaunting around Camelot. And yes. And so there's another thing I just would say, way too, in looking back at it, one thing I should note, it's a locker room, you expect that type of stuff, but I moved to a different bay after he was just standing there because he was just way too comfortable talking to a stranger naked. Now, that being said, this pick is completely, I think this pick is the pick of the Trump transition, of the pick that has been made so far that has triggered a lot of loudmouths that called me prior to the election to suddenly stop calling me. One thing that I frequently say to folks is pay attention when loud people or people that are really obnoxious suddenly become quiet. And there were a few chuckleheads prior to the election who were trying to tell me that it's not that serious, democracy's not on the ballot, who tried to lecture me about pro-life issues and other types of stuff. And these are also people who I know have young children, take vaccines very seriously. The fact that you sat out the election and that you didn't raise a concern, I don't want to hear from you anymore about it, okay? Because you own this. I'm not saying people that were stuck between, there's a lot of people out there that were double haters in this election that decided to write someone in or keep the ballot blank. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people in particular who were trying to tell me that the election of Harris and Walz was not a principled decision and things about that I was raising concerns about democracy and other things, and in particular, Trump's support of RFK would not manifest after the election, who I know are very much like Becky and without assuming maybe are like Preya, that are vaccinated, that embrace science, that want schools to be safe and free from this type of stuff. RFK is going to be a real mess. Here's the other thing I will say to you, and I noticed this on social media in Minnesota, of all of the cabinet picks, particularly that I think could have a political ramification in Minnesota long-term, is the selection of RFK. There is a large Venn diagram of overlay of Republican activists who believe in a lot of the rhetoric from RFK. And without naming names, I will tell you that the introduction of RFK into Trump's administration is going to platform a lot of conspiracies that we may have to relitigate from 2000 and 2022 that are going to come back up in the governor's race and in other races today. And so there's a huge problem that I think both on policy issues that I have with RFK and also as a Republican in Minnesota that I think that he's going to platform. And so of all the picks, this is the one that is the absolute craziest to me. And it's a close second and Matt Gaetz is a close second. I don't want to diminish anything. And we talked about Matt Gaetz last week, Becky. And so the reason why I'm putting this one a little bit ahead, and it's a neck and neck race between 1 and 2, but I'm putting RFK's nomination ahead of it as for other reasons, but Matt Gaetz is a very close second.
Before we move on to a handful of other ones we have here, I want to pose a question to the both of you. Between RFK Jr. and Matt Gaetz and anybody else, do you think there is potential that the Senate bucks them, that the Senate doesn't let these two or others through?
No. There's no reason at this point to think that Matt Gaetz and RFK are not going to be confirmed, or that I think there's going to be a vote. I think there's going to be a vote, but Trump is not. These are not trial balloons. You don't float RFK because you're gonna nominate someone else. There's no reason to think that these are trial balloons. And so I do think there's going to be some potential novel approaches on resets appointments. There, obviously, the Senate has advice and consent, but there's a couple of untested scenarios where by Trump colluding with the House of Representatives and with a Senate appointment that he could offer some recess appointments. So we'll see, but I fully expect RFK and Matt Gaetz I expect Matt Gaetz to be the Attorney General, and I expect RFK to be the head of HHS. Enjoy your McDonald's while you can, folks.
I actually have to disagree with Michael.
Of course you do.
I do think that Matt Gaetz does not make it through Senate confirmation. When I was in DC, I spent a lot of time talking with different folks, consultants, friends of mine that work in the various committees, stuff like that. And the thing that I keep hearing over and over again is that folks know that Matt Gaetz is a problem. Becky, I'm sure from your time in DC as well, you've heard stories from girlfriends about Matt Gaetz being a little creepy and all those different conversations that you have with your girlfriends. But I think that folks understood that Matt Gaetz was a problem. They understood that this House Ethics report was going to come out. And they figured they would nominate him for AG because I can think of 5 Republicans in the Senate right off the bat that probably are not going to vote for him. And then he would go away, would resurface for the governor's race in Florida in 26 because Ron DeSantis is term limited out. And then he would use the rejection of the swamp as his rallying cry for the governor's race in 26. And that just seems to be the sentiment all around. I think folks just know that this is really a non-starter, and I don't think he makes it through. And I think this House Ethics Committee, even if Mike Johnson wants to keep it sealed, the reality is sorry, speaking of Johnson, I think he wants to keep it this House Ethics Committee report under wraps, but the reality is the Roe ruling got leaked by the Supreme Court of all places, and there are some outgoing members on the Dem side on the House Ethics Committee that have nothing to lose. And there are some Republicans who hate Matt Gaetz that might leak it just for the heck of it.
The one point I would say is, as of right now, as of within the last hour or so, the vice president designee, the vice president elect, I should say, Senator J.D. Vance was walking through the Senate with Marco Rubio and Matt Gaetz, and they're putting some investment into this. And so I just will go back to just very quickly is Trump was elected to a 4-year term, but he's got a trifecta for 2 years. And I think he's going to push the envelope on these picks, but we'll see. I hope that in this particular instance, Preya, I'm wrong, and I'm fine being wrong to you.
Moving on, we have Department of Transportation, Sean Duffy, former congressman from Wisconsin. I like
Real World member.
Real World goes way back.
I met him and his wife once. I was shopping at the Mall of America at Brooks Brothers, and he and his wife were there.
They're lovely.
Fully clothed.
Thank you. At the 2016 convention, I took a picture of Tom Emmer and his wife, Jackie, and Sean and Rachel Duffy. And between the 4 of them, they had, I think, 15 or 16 children, which is bonkers because I think the Duffys have 8, maybe 9 now. Wild. But I like this pick. Hey, let's bring some transportation dollars back to Minnesota, the Midwest.
There's big government conservative.
But let me go on to say there's been a lot of gross growth of that budget. And I know that's something that they want Duffy to rake back in, bring back some of those dollars. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, CEO of Denver-based fracking company. Yeah, let's go.
What are you going to say? What are you going to say? You're supposed to say, drill, baby, drill.
Yeah, baby. Sorry, my dog started barking. There is no mincing of words here that they're trying to be all in on the fracking. He's expected to restart some of the national gas export permits halted under Biden. I don't know enough about him personally, but let's do it.
Okay.
100%.
My main focus has been on RFK, Gaetz, and by the way, can we just say again, it takes a lot of effort to have Kristi Noem not be the lightning rod. They found a way to do that.
I think that
Congresswoman Kristi Noem.
There you go.
I should correct myself.
Governor Kristi Noem.
Oh, governor. That's right. Former Congresswoman. Sorry.
I think last week I had mentioned, but I had seen a tweet that Kristi Noem was great or was pleased when Gaetz was announced. Gaetz was just waiting for RFK to be announced, and they all got the stories off of them. Department of Education is a little interesting to me. Linda McMahon. My husband is a big WWE fan. Linda McMahon
great.
is the co-founder, former president and CEO
That's cool.
of the WWE with Vince McMahon. There's a great Netflix special that he made me watch with him. That's just
God, his stock is going up. That's great.
Wild. It's wild. But an interesting, she's ran for Congress unsuccessfully. She served as administrator of the SBA for 2 years under Trump. It's not far. This is not out of her wheelhouse to be in this. It will be interesting.
It's not fall out of her wheelhouse.
To be in a public service position. She's been in this arena. She's been in the WWE arena far more.
And that's a comparable skill to be the Secretary of Education. I feel like your husband
if we have a
needs
throwdown and we completely eliminate the
I feel like your husband
Education.
needs to be the one that determines is whether her WWE experience is warrants or so.
Yes.
We're going to have to get a report from him.
We might have to go a little bit more in depth for this later because I was forced into watching a little bit of this special and there's a lot to this family. The VA, we have Doug Collins, former congressman from Georgia, who served 10 years there. He was among the 8 House Republicans who served on the defense team for Trump's first Senate impeachment trial, former Air Force chaplain, and served in Iraq. Any strong thoughts there?
Thank him for his service, but he's a Trump loyalist.
Yeah. And then the last comment I wanted to make of recent nomination or recent announcements is the new White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She's 27 years old. She's going to be the youngest in U.S. history to serve in this position. She was national press secretary on his campaign and was previously assistant press secretary under Kayleigh McEnany. Seems to be doing what she needs to do in Trump world.
I was gunning and hoping it was going to be Laura Loomer. And then if it wasn't going to be Laura Loomer, I was hoping it was going to be Preya. And then it wasn't going to be Preya. I was hoping it was going to be you, Becky. I'm indifferent. I think it's great that she's the youngest and a woman. I think that's great, but
yeah,
I think she's totally qualified. So I don't know what more.
Everything I've heard, she is a very hard worker. Last to leave the office, first one to go in. And she's a fighter for the Trump administration, the Trump agenda. And I think that's exactly what he's looking for. As somebody who's going to be up there battling with reporters day in and day out. And frankly, I think anybody at this point is better than KJP.
I haven't heard any. I haven't been tracking. I saw the pick was announced, but I haven't heard any robust criticism. And kudos for getting the job. Be a great job.
Yeah, in a job I would. Who wants that? Obviously, it's very highly regarded, but no thanks. Hard pass.
Yeah. Just a quick note on something. CNN is on, and there's a breaking news Trump transition. Trump says he's not reconsidering Gaetz' pick as controversy builds. Preya, you need to get better talking points.
Look, all I'll say is this. You got to stand by your man, even if you are playing in the double deal.
Yeah, he can't double down. He can't say he made a mistake before he's even taken the office.
Yeah.
I could see him doing some Veep stuff and working behind the scenes to get him voted down, but then it's the Senate that made that flip. It's not going to be him. But I do want to move on with the remainder of our time. Michael, you also had an op-ed that was placed just this week titled "No Regrets from This Republican About Endorsing Harris." I am sure that you have had a lot of people who have poked you and made fun and asked you like, oh, you regret it now if you knew what you want to know now. And so I think it's great that you wrote this because you've talked about on this podcast about some of the points you shared in here. In particular, I want to hear a little bit more again about your trip to Pennsylvania and what that meant with the historical significance. But you talked about how this wasn't a bet for you. You were not betting. You did not endorse Harris and Walz because you were betting that they were going to win. You endorsed them because you principally believed that they were the best choice for the next leaders of this country. So talk a little bit about your decision here with no regrets and why you wanted to.
It was born from some of those conversations. I had a number of people who, as the election got closer, and we talked to this a little bit about the podcast, Becky, you and I did, where people were approaching from the standpoint, she might not win. And I think you and I had been, and Preya helped with this. We had a number of podcast episodes, independent of this decision for a second, where we framed out the stakes in this election. I think it was one of the, very, aside from Preya's commentary of offering, points on right track, wrong track, everything, it was also Mark Drake who raised those points. And we do a lot of listening on this podcast, and we have a lot of balanced discussions. We did not live I don't think, Becky, that you and I lived in a political bubble related to the election. Independent of where I thought the race would be, this was the decision I was going to make. And I stand by the decision without any reservation. First and foremost, democracy was on the ballot. And there's some ribbing that I got from people saying, well, this was the last election, now that democracy's done. You know how democracy was on the ballot? Is because Kamala Harris and Tim Walz accepted the results of the election and gave and bestowed upon Trump and Vance a gift that he has not bestowed upon Joe Biden. And it's a mark on our history. And so they recognized the results of the election, acknowledged the fact that they lost, and without reservation, that has been an orderly and clean process. I understand that there's still some election fights going on in some Senate races, but that's not a point. That rhetoric is not coming from the vice president or from Governor Walz. So yes, and that has really tampered down the rhetoric. We would be in an entirely different place today, rhetorically and as a country, if Harris and Walz would have won, because that type of thoughtful, principled response was not going to happen on the other side. And so I stand by it from that standpoint. And I will also say the more I've gotten away from, the farther I've been away from that event in Pennsylvania, the more I've realized, having listened to the speech and knew that I was there, it was a very important moment politically and for this country. And I absolutely believe in it. I believe that there are times when we have to choose country over party. I was not someone, although I would be classified as a never Trumper, none of my analysis or rhetoric or commentary was derogatory in any sense, in any of the way of which J.D. Vance did, who called him America's Hitler. We've had a lot of podcast episodes where we have platformed and wanted to get insight and perspective from people who were passionately supporting Donald Trump. And I know probably, if I did a tally, the vast majority of our guests voted for Trump over voting for Harris in a particular. And I appreciate that. But all of those conversations were well rooted, and I appreciated that perspective. But on many principled reasons, I stood by that decision, and it was important for me to circle back and say, you're goddamn right I did that, and I'm proud of it. And I'm very proud of the fact that I did it. I do have concerns remaining about Trump and the Constitution and the rule of law. On a couple points. First of all, I've checked off democracy, and I think that there's some issues there. A couple points I'd also make. Trump has waged a pretty aggressive war against the First Amendment, calling for the licenses of television broadcast stations to be revoked through the FCC and other things. He has called for an investigation into a pollster with the Des Moines Register about a poll that was released. Now, I want to separate media criticisms, which we all have, and I think we should discuss more in future episodes. And we, in fact, Becky, on our election night poll, on our election night live stream, we discussed with John Rouleau questions about that poll and what should be done. And so there's a difference between there being a thoughtful breakdown of the methodology and how that poll was constructed, and for the President of the United States, who has the power of the Department of Justice under his wing, to call for an investigation into a pollster. That is concerning to me. That type of weaponization and that kind of blurring of the lines that exists between the president and abiding by it's pretty clear to me that the only type of First Amendment that Trump appreciates is the kind that supports his cause. And let me tell you something. I'm a big liberal on the First Amendment. And our show lineup is a reflection of that. We have people on every week, Becky, that disagree with us. In the aftermath of me endorsing Harris and Walz, I reached out to you and said, hey, if we're talking about things, let's make sure that since I've endorsed a side, that we're being balanced and we're offering that full perspective. I think that Trump has a real problem with the First Amendment unless he agrees with the speech. And I believe that the best way to combat the speech you don't like is to have more of it, not to call for investigations and to weaponize things. Finally, I do have concerns about some of the nominations and the process that he's going to lay into. Donald Trump has discussed using an untested constitutional theory about, in essence, doing recess appointments in a collaborative way with the House, potentially, and with the Senate, that would allow him to bypass the advise and consent that the United States Senate has with confirmation picks. That is concerning to me. Finally, Donald Trump is constitutionally precluded from seeking a third term. There is something that Donald Trump has a pattern of doing, which is raising trial balloons and joking about stuff. He has alluded to, and I will disclose in a joking manner, the possibility of trying to seek a third term. He floats those types of things for a reason, and because he's hoping that people pick up on them. And I understand there's an element of joke in it. But Donald Trump, I think, is is the arguments that I were making prior to the election. My concerns that I raised still exist today, particularly with some of the picks that he's made, particularly with RFK and HHS. There's, I think, a number of conservative Republicans, particularly those who champion themselves as pro-life Republican advocates, that should really examine RFK's record and some of his rhetoric, because I could really hold them up to some inconsistent standard. The bottom line is, I stand by my choice. I'm proud of it. If I could do it all over again, I would. One other point that I wanted to make with the op-ed is this, and it dovetails a little bit in, and I want to give folks an opportunity to chime in and push back on anything you want. But in particular, Donald Trump lost this state. If you look at the election results, I endorsed Harris when there was, at a time in which it was August, it was a short campaign. Over those 100+ days, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of Republicans and independents in this state who did not feel comfortable with Donald Trump, and to this day don't. And I think that in order for a Republican to succeed in this state, Republicanism can succeed in this state. And in my op-ed, I discussed that Donald Trump underperformed the congressional candidates in every congressional district except in CD2. Kamala Harris outperformed the DFL candidate for Congress in every district except in CD2. And so there was a unique dynamic going on in CD2. But what that shows is that the margin of victory, if you were to tally up what all the Republican congressional candidates got versus all the DFL congressional candidates got, that's a very tight margin. It's, I think, less than a point difference. But if you look at where Trump and Harris are, it's 5 points, 4 to 5 points. What that means is that Trump's MAGA brand is not electable in this state. But Republicanism can have a path. And in the aftermath of the election, I've seen party officers and people connected to the Republican Party go out there and try to say that if you are not a Trump Republican, you need to get out. It's a complete misreading of the election results. It's an absolute misreading of the election results, because Trump underperformed in this state. And I want to just point out that one thing that I learned over the last 100+ days in being a volunteer is that the way the DFL runs these campaigns is entirely different. They and the Republicans, I think, are behind the curve immensely, but there are a lot of Republicans in this state who believe in the Republican Party, want to support Republican candidates, who do not believe in Donald Trump's brand. And Republicans, I think, in this state have to recognize, in order to win statewide, because the numbers are there, that they have to start building coalitions and stop kicking people out of this party. I think it was a complete misreading of the election that they've had. And I hope they're introspective about it. One other point I will make in closing is that Republicans swept. They have a trifecta right now because of Trump's victory. And as of right now, they have United States Senate and on the congressional level. Republicans in Minnesota contributed nothing to those gains. Kamala Harris won this state because of a broad base of Democrats, Republicans, and independents that supported her. Republicans lost the CD2 race, and they lost the U.S. Senate race. But the numbers are there if they want to see how the path to win. And the path to win is to build a tent, be a coalition party like the Democrats have come to be, and understand and recognize that Donald Trump may have a place in this party, but it's not to help candidates win statewide.
With that, because I think we've chatted about that a little bit even in the days since the election, of how Trump failing here should send a message to the Republican Party of Minnesota and Minnesota Republican activists, campaigns, everything going forward. But will it? Or how do you think we, as in myself, Preya, if she chooses, anybody else who is listening, how do we work to get that message across, that we can stand for Republican principles and policies? We don't necessarily have to stand in opposition to Donald Trump, but we don't have to embrace the MAGA world and stay in that lane. Is there some advice? Is there a way we can do that? Because I think that one thing that I've been personally frustrated with, that you and I have discussed with both of our not necessarily feeling super in touch with the current Republican Party in our state, is that frustration and the kind of internal battle of wanting to change it, but also, like, I didn't caucus this last time around. You have to be involved to change it, but it's frustrating to be involved because of who's involved. So it's a cyclical issue. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Do you have $1 million answer for me?
I have an example, but I want to give Preya an opportunity to respond on something. Go ahead if you'd like to.
I think we just have to be more like thoughtful, to be frank. To your point, Michael, and I think that's probably an underlying theme of this entire discussion today is just I think we as a party need to be more thoughtful. The RNC did this following the complete sweep that Democrats had in 2012, where Obama just had this big organization with OFA. It's similar to what Democrats have had in state for years. But Obama had OFA, Obama for America. It was their big, like, organizing efforts where they could invest in multiple states and races across the country. And it helped them really sweep in a way that forced Republicans to take a deep, hard look of why they were continuing to lose. And I don't think Republicans in this state have ever really had that moment where they're like, okay, it's time for some self-reflection and figure out, okay, why have we really lost? What needs to be done better? And who do we bring in to actually move the needle here? And I think until that actually happens, that change is not going to exist. And I think it's going to force more people like Michael to have to make hard stances that they're probably like it like, and I don't want to speak for you, Michael, on this. You're not a Republican. You did not vote top of the ticket with us. Lord knows Becky and I have had disagreements with you about your why Kamala Harris and why Tim Walz. But it's a principle stand that you took that not a lot of people would have the courage to do and still vote down ballot. You are one of those cross ticket voters, and there are plenty of them in Minnesota. And I think until we take a hard look to understand why cross ticket voters exist in this state, why there are folks who feel the need to vote Democrat and then Republican or vice versa, we're never going to find the tools that we need to be successful, whether it's in congressional races where we just gave up 50,000 votes to Angie Craig in her largest margin of win in the 2nd district, or statewide. And that's just the reality.
I will give great points, Preya, and I appreciate that. Appreciate what you said. I will give this example in my closing on this subject, which is this. In the final week of the election in Minnesota, someone decided that it was good to elevate Donald Trump into a congressional district race down in CD2 with some endorsements. Let me explain something to you a position that I've long had about outreach. I believe outreach is incredibly important. I remember when I was a party officer and there was talk about outreach to various communities. And one of the points that what I would say is, it's always important to have outreach, but let's dial in on the numbers and let's not use the cause of outreach as an excuse to not win over where larger pools of voters exist. Outreach in some instances can just be feel good. It has to be meaningful. And what I'm saying to you is, when the Republican Party is deciding to slap on a Trump endorsement and try to drag it into the 2nd congressional district, they're dragging Donald Trump into a congressional district race where a large number of suburban voters don't like Donald Trump. But they're doing it under the guise of outreach. It makes no sense. Outreach needs to be done. The Republican Party in Minnesota, the Republican Party needs to have a broad tent. It should have a tent in everywhere. But the bottom line is the party exists to win elections. And if you're alienating a large swath of voters, you can do all the penny ante outreach you want to every other group. But if you're not winning over a larger number of voters, you're still going to lose the election. And so I would just say to the Republicans who want to act like they've entered the end zone, you haven't. You didn't win the game. You lost the state of Minnesota. Republicans in Minnesota did not contribute to the national gain statewide. And you have an opportunity to look into the data, look into the results. There's a path for Republicans to win in the state, but it ain't Donald Trump.
I don't disagree. It's going to be something that I think I have an internal battle with in the coming years. I would like to get involved again and be hopefully a voice of reason at times, and changing over how things are done. Whether it will be welcomed or I have the courage to do it, yet to be determined. So we'll continue to talk about this. It's not going to be something that goes away. There's going to be Republicans not supporting President Trump, just as there are independents and obviously Democrats. As Michael and I have talked about in the last 3 weeks or 2 weeks since the election, is we are still cautiously optimistic and want to be supportive of the office of the presidency and our country's future. And so while we have frustrations, I don't think that fact remains. We're not wishing ill on him or his success. I hope that things can be calm and reasoned and have a successful path forward. And we will see. And the good news is we have a weekly podcast where we get to chat about that either way. But Preya, I really want to thank you for being with us today. Before we wrap up, I just have to do one quick comment on our weekly football update. There's no update is really the thing. Michael and I had the exact same amount of points this week. While we did have 6 different games that we chose different winners, we still came out tied. I still remain in the lead by 3, currently tied for first, and Michael still remains tied for 5th. So it was, in all, despite being tied, an okay week for me.
I'm making progress. As Preya may not know, the reason I've been slacking this year in a couple of fantasy football leagues is I've been out defending democracy. Becky has been, toiling away at a fantasy football team. So she got a little bit of a run. I will note that in my family fantasy football league, I did beat one of my sisters this week. And so only by a point. And I'm really proud of that. So the comeback begins. This is where, now that democracy, I'm still focused a bit on democracy, but I was defending it pretty strongly. And fantasy football had to take a backseat. But I'm going to try to balance some of my priorities. And it's a long season, Becky. Plenty of time for you to still have a technical malfunction.
Sure. Not gonna happen. I got my weekly alarm set. I'm in it for the win.
Okay. Preya and Becky, I want to just thank you both. This will be my new favorite episode. I want to thank you again for being on here, okay? And I do hope that you guys Becky, I think you'd be a very thoughtful voice. You always have been a thoughtful voice, even when you disagreed with me. You've always been thoughtful. And I think, Preya, you guys and a whole group of people should be out there leading the storm on this stuff. And Preya, I really thank you for taking the time and being a part of the discussion, okay?
No, thank you guys for having me.
All right. Before we go, we want to thank you for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website and follow us across all social media platforms at BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back soon. Thank you so much. Have a great week.
Bye.